Hi guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this high top Converse shoe for your American Girl doll. And for the first 20 to 23 minutes it will be the same tutorial as the ballet shoe and slip-on shoes because it's generally the same design, and towards the end I'm going to be adding on to make it into the high top or Converse shoe that you see here. You're going to need about 450 to 500 bands to make each shoe. So let's get started. Let's take a single band and loop it 4 times on a hook. Grabbing 2 single bands, we're going to pull those 2 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting it on a hook. And make sure it's centered, and we're going to continue with 2 single bands, creating a single chain 10 loops long. So that's 2, 3, 'This is my last 2 bands for my 10th loop. I pull it through and I just flip the chain over so my bands aren't twisted when I get it on my hook, like that. So you have 10 single chain. We're going to count up. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll go to the 7th loop. Put a hook through from the top through the bottom, and you should have 4 loops on your hook from the chain plus 4 from that was on a hook. Using 2 single bands at a time, we're going to pull those loops through the chain loops and onto a hook. So now we have 8 loops on a hook. Taking 2 more single bands, we're going to pull the 6 front loops onto the 2 single bands. So that's 2, 4, 6, and getting the 2 loops on the 2 single bands, or the 4 loops onto a hook. So now we have 6 loops on a hook. Our last 2 single bands for this set, we're going to pull all 6 loops onto the 2 single bands. So that's what it should look like. We're going to repeat that pattern again, going to the next loop down, put a hook through from the top to the bottom, getting 4 loops on a hook from the chain, and we're not putting it into the same hole that we put our last set. Once again, grabbing 2 single bands, pulling those loops and getting them onto a hook attached to the chain, getting 2 more single bands, and we're going to pull the 6 loops off of our hook and onto the 2 single bands. And the 2 loops that's furthest behind stays on a hook, and grabbing the other side of the loops for the 2 single bands. We're left with 6 loops on a hook, grabbing our last 2 rubber bands for this set and pulling all the 6 loops onto our hook. So that's set number 2. I'm going to continue all the way down to where my slip knot band is, that loop. So once again, go into the next loop and repeat the same pattern. 2 single bands, getting the loops off of the chain and onto the 2 single bands, onto a hook, getting 2 more single bands, getting the 6 front loops onto our hook, and grabbing the other side of the loops for our 2 single bands. And lastly, taking our 2 single bands and getting all the 6 loops onto the 2 single bands, and we're left with 4 loops. And we'll continue the same pattern till we get to the one with the slip knot band. So I'm down to the loop where my slip knot band is. Once again, putting your hook through those loops, getting our 2 bands onto our hook, grabbing 2 more single bands, pulling the 6 loops onto the 2 single bands, and leaving 6 loops on a hook. Our last 2 bands for the set, getting all 6 loops onto the 2 single bands. Now we'll go in the loop where the slip knot band is. So this is set 1. We'll do 2 more sets, putting a hook through that loop where the slip knot band is, and repeating the same pattern. Grabbing our 2 single bands onto a hook, 2 more single bands, getting the 6 loops onto our 2 single bands, and getting the other side onto a hook, leaving 6 loops, and our last 2 bands for the set, pulling it through. The last set we're going to repeat, go in the slip knot band loop again and repeat the same pattern. Now we're going to go in the second loop. We're not going to go back in the same loop where the slip knot band is. Go to the second one, put a hook through, getting the 4 loops on a hook, grabbing our 2 single bands, and repeat the same pattern. And if you're confused, go ahead and watch the video a couple times before you try making your shoe. I'm going to continue up each loop till I get to the 7th loop up here. So just repeat the same pattern, going to the next loop on our chain and pulling the 2 bands and repeating our pattern. If the bottom of your shoe is curling up, you should do 1 more set on the loop where this slip knot band is, so that way it doesn't curl up, it'll stay straight. Just continue. Up our chain. You should measure your doll's foot to the sole of the shoe to make sure it's about right. And this size is good enough for the American Girl doll. So we're at the 6th loop on the single chain that we first made. I'm on my 7th one, so I'm going to make the heel slightly smaller. So on my 7th loop, I'm going to take my hook, putting it in the loop, getting the 4 bands, grabbing our 2 single bands. We'll pull the loops onto our hook, grabbing 2 more single bands, and we'll pull all 8 loops onto our hook, making our heel slightly smaller. Now go in the 8th loop. So this is the 7th loop. Go in the 8th one that's right next to it. we're just going to take 2 single bands and we're going to pull the loops for the 2 single bands all the way through and getting the 2 single band loops onto a hook. So you have 4 loops onto a hook. So that's the sole of my shoe. And now straighten it out. So the sole of my shoe is done, and now we're going to loop up for the second row. So taking 2 single bands, we're starting a second row, looping it and getting it onto a hook. One more set of 2 single bands, so getting it onto a hook. So now we have these loops for our second row. Going to go in this loop here next to the bands that connected our heel together. Go in that loop and repeat the same pattern. Grabbing 2 single bands, getting the loops onto a hook, creating 8 loops. Grab 2 more single bands and pull the first 6 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting them onto a hook like that, leaving 6 loops. Grabbing the last 2 single bands and pulling all 6 loops onto a hook. The next loop, same thing, just go in, getting the 4 loops on a hook, grabbing our 2 single bands, and just repeat the same pattern. If you want the sole of your shoe, the side of it, to show a little bit, and the sole is a different color for your shoe, then just grab the top 2 single bands off of the loop and the soles will show for your shoes. But I'm just going to go through all the way through to the bottom, grabbing the 4 loops and repeating the pattern. I'm going to go all the way around till I get to this side to connect my second row for my shoe. Repeating that same pattern, going to every single loop around our shoe. I'm to the front of my shoe and it's going to be too curled up for me, so I'm going to put my hook through this loop here on the top corner, and I'll repeat the set twice. So put your hook through the same loop, the same one you did your last set, for these 2 loops and these 2 loops. Just repeat the same pattern. So before you go on, check your shoes to make sure it's okay, it's not too tight, and it's relatively curved for a second row. And if it is, then go ahead and go to the next loops and go all the way around to where we start the second row. But if it's still too tight for you, then go ahead and continue another set on the same loop. I'm just going to move on. Again, your shoes, the looseness or the tightness might vary depending on the kind of rubber band you use. Mine's pretty loose, so it's not too tight. So I just finished my last loop for this row, and I'm going to put my hook through the single chain that we looped up, so that's 1, 2, and putting a hook through like that. So I counted 1, 2 up from where we created the single chain to start the row, taking 2 single bands and pulling all 8 loops on the 2 single bands. And at this point you should look at your shoes and measure it to your doll's foot to make sure it will fit her okay. So that's what mine looks like so far on my doll, and I don't want it any higher on this side. If you're using tighter bands, you may need to do another row for your shoes. So since mine is pretty good on both sides for my doll, the side at least, for my slip-on shoes and my ballet shoes, I'm going to go ahead and make a slip knot and tie off that row. And if you need to do another row just from where we put our last 2 bands, do 2 single chain with 2 single bands and then start your row once again. So there's my slip-on shoes or ballet slipper so far. Let's tuck in our slip knot band. So what it should look like. So there's my shoes. I'm going to measure it to see where I need to add the bands for the top to cover my toes. And from looking at the shoe, I'm going to start on these loops here, on that loop. So get the foot off of the shoe. I'm going to put my hook through from the inside out, getting the 4 loops onto the hook, grabbing 2 single bands, and we'll pull the loops onto a hook. Since this is the side of our shoe, we're going to put a hook through the loop right next to it, getting the 4 loops onto a hook. So we have 4 loops from the 2 single bands and now 4 loops from the rim of our shoe, taking 2 single bands, and we'll pull all the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting the 4 loops onto a hook like that. Now let's go to the next loop on our shoe, putting a hook through, grabbing 2 more single bands and getting the loops onto our hook. So now we have 8 loops on a hook, grabbing 2 single bands and pulling the 8 loops onto our hook, leaving 4 loops. And let's continue around to cover our toes. Once again, go to the next loop on our shoes, grabbing 2 single bands, pulling those loops through and getting the loop onto our hook, leaving 8 loops, grabbing 2 more single bands and pulling the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting it onto a hook. So that's what it should look like so far. Let's continue around, and when we get to this one, we're going to switch it up back to the same as we did the looping on this side, so our shoes look proportional. Once again, go in the loop next to it. We're going to pull the 2 single bands through, getting the loops onto a hook, leaving 8 loops, getting 2 more bands and pulling all 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and onto a hook. 2 more times, repeating the same pattern. Here I am on my shoe, so I'll do for this loop and that loop the same pattern we just did. So that's what my slip-on shoe or my ballet shoe should look like at this point. Now for this next loop, we're putting a hook through, grabbing our 2 single bands, and getting all the loops onto the 2 single bands. Like that. And we'll do it one more time to make it proportional on both sides. Now we're going to go to the next loop, putting a hook through, and I'm switching to purple to make my high top, grabbing my 2 single bands and getting all the loops off of my hook and onto the 2 single bands. And this will start my row for my high top, and taking 2 single bands, I'm going to create a single chain with 2 single bands, and I'll do it 3 loops high. So that's my third one, getting it onto my hook. So that's what yours should look like. To start the first row for our high top, we're going to put a hook through this first loop here where our purple band is, and putting a hook from the inside out, getting the 4 loops onto our hook, and repeating the same pattern. We're going to grab our 2 bands, getting the loops onto our hook. So we have 8 loops on a hook, grabbing 2 more bands and getting the front 6 loops onto the 2 single bands, leaving 6 loops on a hook, or on our last 2 bands for this set, pulling all 6 loops onto the 2 single bands. And I'm going to repeat this same pattern for every single row on our shoe till we get to this side of our shoe. So going to my next loop and just repeating that pattern for that set. And I'll come back when I'm on this side of my shoe. I just finished my set to the other side of my shoes. Now I'm going to take the loops off of my hook, turn my shoe around, and putting those loops back onto my hook. Taking 2 single bands, and we're going to create a single chain for row number 2 for our high top. One more time, taking 2 single bands and pulling those loops onto the 2 single bands. Now we're going to put a hook through this first loop along the top of our shoe, and we're going to go back around to the other side of our high top. So repeating the same pattern, grabbing our 2 single bands, pulling the loops onto a hook, creating 8 loops, getting 2 more single bands, pulling the first 6 loops onto the 2 single bands, leaving 6 loops on our hook, and our last 2 bands for this set, getting all the 6 loops onto the 2 single bands. Repeat the same pattern for each loop along the top of our high top, and I'll come back when I get to this side of my high top. I'm back to the other side and finished my second row for my high top, and at this point you can take your doll's foot to measure it to make sure it's the right height for you, and that looks about right for me for my doll. And if yours isn't high enough, go ahead and do the same thing, repeating another row by taking your hook off and adding more single chain to start the next row, and then repeating the same pattern across the top of your shoe to get to the other side. Since this is good enough for me, I'm going to go ahead and tie a slip knot and cinch it off and tucking it inside the slip knot band inside my shoe to hide it. So there's my high top so far, and on my left side I'm going to put my hook through the loops here along the top of my shoe to add a little bit more before we add the tongue. So putting a hook from the outside in, grabbing whatever color band you're using, getting it onto your hook and pulling the loops through and getting the two loops onto your hook. Going to the next loop, putting a hook through, grabbing our two single bands, and we're going to get all the loops off of our hook and onto the two single bands, and now we have 4 loops on the hook. Let's continue to the next loop. Once again, putting a hook through from the outside in, grabbing 2 single bands, and we're going to get the loops onto our hook. We have 8 loops on our hook, getting 2 more single bands and pulling all 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and onto our hook. And now we're going to skip a loop on the top because we don't want the top of our shoe to be too big. So we're skipping one, putting a hook through the second loop along the top of our shoe. So on this one, grabbing 2 single bands and pulling the loops onto our hook, creating 8 loops on a hook, taking 2 more single bands and pulling all 8 loops onto our hook like that. And now just go to the next loop next to it, put a hook through, grabbing our 2 single bands and getting all 8 loops onto our hook, and taking our last 2 single bands for this set and getting it all onto the 2 single bands and onto our hook. So that's what it should look like, and if you're confused, just watch it first. We just essentially are repeating the same pattern for the top right now. Now go to the next loop, putting a hook through, grabbing our 2 single bands and getting all 8 loops onto a hook, grabbing 2 more single bands and pulling all 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting the 4 loops onto our hook. So there's the top of my shoe so far, and now we'll just put a hook through the loop where our high top is attached. Same one, grabbing our 2 single bands, and we're going to pull all those loops off of our hook and onto the 2 single bands. Let's make the tongue for our shoe, and we're going to take the loops off of a hook so we can go back around and turn our shoe around, getting the loops back onto our hook, Now taking your tongue color, I'm using pink and getting the loops off of our hook and onto the 2 single bands. And one more time, taking 2 single bands and pulling all the loops off of our hook and onto the 2 single bands. Now let's go to the next loop, putting a hook through from the inside out, grabbing the 2 single bands and getting the loops onto our hook. Now we have 8 loops, grabbing 2 single bands, getting the first 6 loops off of our hook and onto the 2 single bands, leaving us with 6 loops, grabbing 2 more single bands for this set and pulling all 6 loops onto the 2 single bands. And let's just repeat the pattern all the way across to this side. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4 loops, repeating the same pattern. So there's the tongue so far. Now taking the loops off of our hook, and we want to go back around, creating another row, getting the loops back onto our hook. And creating our chain, single chain again with 2 single bands for 2 loops. It's my second one. Once again, go in the loop right next to it and repeat the same pattern. I'm going to do my last loop for my tongue, just once again repeating the same pattern, getting the 2 loops or the 8 loops onto a hook, getting 2 single bands and getting the 6 front loops onto the 2 single bands, and our last 2 single bands, pulling all 6 loops onto the 2 single bands and tying it off. And let's tuck in that slip knot band. So there's our high top so far with our tongue for our shoes, and let's put the lace on. For our shoelace, I just made a single chain, 17 loops long, and you can make it longer or shorter, and we're just going to push it through the front holes along our high top and thread it through to tie our shoes. So there's our lace for our shoes. Get it onto our doll's foot. So there's a high top for your American Girl doll. I hope you like it. Thanks for watching.